Today, Jahan and I speak with Richard Bartlett. Richard became inspired nearly a decade ago by the Occupy Wall Street movement and subsequently became a mission-driven software entrepreneur. For 10 years, he has been building applications that empower teams to think deliberately and make better decisions. If we are building the tools today that decide how much influence algorithms have versus humans, Richard is firmly interested in supporting our humanity through smart decision-making tools, rather than simplifying it through algorithmic business logic within decentralized organizations. In this episode, we touch on culture, macro, Web3, inequality, and even some spirituality. Hope you enjoy the episode.
So thanks for joining us, Richard. Maybe you could kick it off by telling us a little bit about who you are as a person. How did you get into this? How did you get into decentralized organization? Maybe we can start there.
I guess I got into it by my experience in one of the most centralized organizations, which is the Christian church. That's my background. I grew up in quite it's like a fundamentalist Christian community that was quite, if I said a cult, that would be taking it too far, but a very tight-knit community with a very strict set of rules. And it was a space where like there's kind of one reality, there's one right answer for every question, and there's a very clear chain of command. You know, it's like the pecking order in my family was us kids, and then my mum, and then my dad. Dad's at the top of the stack, and then within the church, it's like there's like a council of elders who are above all of the dads, and then there's the preacher, the minister, who is above all the elders, and then there's, it kind of goes up. There's a very clear international hierarchy that eventually gets to God. So it's like the ultimate, monotheism is like the ultimate hierarchy in a way.
At least your father wasn't the minister, which was my situation.
Right. So there's a little bit of distance to play with there.
Yeah, and I think that at least the hierarchy itself originates describing the hierarchy within the church. Like it literally comes from that, right? So
yeah,
perfect.
Yeah, I forgot to mention the angels between God and the people as the angels.
As you would.
Anyway, but I bring in that context because there is something really important about the community side of that, which we can talk about more later. But that was how I came up, and I grew up in a really remote. Well, I'm from New Zealand, which is already remote, but I grew up in a remote part of New Zealand in this, marginal Christian culture. So I kind of come from the middle of nowhere, and left the church in my early 20s. Well, I say I quit. They say they excommunicated me. So, it's a bit of a tussle for the story there. But after leaving the church, which was like my entire community, my entire school, everyone I knew, I was cast adrift for a while and eventually found my way into basically like a punk, underground, hardcore metal scene in Wellington, like quite a cool DIY music scene. And there was a lot of like, kind of a lot of nihilists there, and a lot of like kind of people that were lost and upset. But then there were also some really awesome political movements happening in there as well, like the best,
yes,
what I think of as the best of the punk scene, which is a critique of the status quo and a commitment to, like a bottom-up alternative way of living and a way of mutual aid, taking care of people. That's what I saw there. And it was through those people that I found my way into Occupy Wellington, which was like basically after Occupy Wall Street started. I think it was basically like a month after they first took Zuccotti Park and Wall Street. There was a global day of action, and all around the world, all of these new Occupy camps started. And I like wandered into the one in Wellington quite randomly. And that was my introduction to decentralized organizing, because you have this global movement where all around I think there was like actions in like 3,000 cities at the same time. Like there was actions on Antarctica.
Yeah.
It was like every continent was covered with people that were somehow participating in this larger organism, but there was no central command. There was no like committee that was like, okay, you're in charge of the Americas and you guys do Oceania or something. It was like completely emergent and bottom up and spontaneous, and just like a collection of memes and people feeling a sense of connection without actually having some formal organizing structure to tell them what to do. So there was that like decentralized element of all of the different camps happening in different parts of the world. And that was immediately like mind-blowing for me as a symbol of like, one of the metaphors we used at the time was like, this is the Earth's immune system or something, it's like all of these people have got activated, in a kind of spontaneous way. So there's that dimension. And then the other dimension was how we actually organized the camps, which was based on direct democracy. So we'd have a general assembly every day and a couple hundred people would show up, and we would negotiate about, how are people going to be fed and what are we doing with shelter and waste, and what are we going to do when the cameras show up? What are we going to tell them? And what's our mission and values? And, like this process of welcoming all of the voices in and just trying to figure out how to build consensus together on the ground. That was, the other half, I think, of the decentralized organizing of Occupy, which is quite a different flavor from the international dimension. The local dimension was much more consensus focused, whereas the international dimension was much more emergent and divergent and a bit chaotic. So that both of those halves of the story really blew my mind and gave me a huge sense of inspiration and purpose. And so when Occupy eventually ran out of steam, it was like a temporary moment. It was obviously not going to last forever. Me and my friends, some of them, the punks that I mentioned, really had this quest of like, okay, how do we found something amazing here. How do we keep it going? Like, how does this translate into a long-term mission? What can we do with that? And that's where the software project Loomio came from.
Oh, and before we get into that too, like maybe you could tell us a bit about what was so amazing about it, right? Because I think we're 11, 12 years removed from Occupy, right? Like when you talk about what was amazing about, the two things that you saw there coming out of, the punk movement and then getting into Occupy, what is the itness about it that really captured you, right? Like, because it's hard to capture now, looking back. Occupy is like, oh, it's that worldwide thing against the 1% and whatever, right? It has its own story and propaganda. But for you, what was really the thing that stood out in your experience that was so worth reproducing in these other organizations you're a part of?
There's so much to that question. One dimension, like the first thing that I saw, which was one of the most important things, was citizens. I mean, it was the first time I'd seen a citizen, I think, like, as in, these people are strangers to me, but we do have a shared stake in the place that we live. And it was the first time I'd seen, we were in Civic Square in Wellington, which is like where the town hall is, it's like, it's the place to be a citizen. And one of the first things that we talked about as an emerging group coming together was someone asked the question, why did you come here today? And the answers to that were really profound, because most of what I heard people say were like, these strangers, these citizens disclosing a huge amount of fear and anxiety about the future for economic reasons or for environmental reasons or for social reasons, like the sense that our social fabric is kind of falling to pieces. And the big picture of, the ecological situation where it seems like we are destroying our habitat at a rapidly accelerating pace. And the systems that we've designed to govern us are not fit for purpose. Like we're not even tapping the brakes, like it's not about steering in a different direction. We're kind of accelerating. And what I heard from all these strangers was, man, I'm really freaked out. I don't know how we get through this. Like, it's just, am I the only one? And that sense of acknowledging for the first time and disclosing, hey, these are some of the fears that I carry around with me, and meeting all these other people that had the same view on reality than I did was mind blowing. Like, there's a lot of us. It's not just, I'd been reading Adbusters and hanging out with my punk friends and thinking like, there's a tiny little marginal group of people that are concerned about the future, but actually there's lots of people and we just don't usually talk about it. So that piece was mind blowing, just to have a sense of honesty and connection across. That, like I said, we connected as citizens despite not having any other relationship. That was really cool for me. And then the process of direct democracy itself was fucking cool. Like there were times where, like we're talking about, hey, we should do some kind of action, like we should, I don't know, do a protest, or what are we going to do? What's the next thing that we've got energy, we've got people, what are we going to do? And there was one, where people are bringing their different proposals, like, I think we should go to the stock market and we should pick at the stock market. And like all these really boring ideas were coming up. And then there was like a 6-year-old kid who's like, we should have a parade. And everyone like immediately consents to that. And it's like, that's a genius idea. And just seeing how when you listen to everyone, you get good ideas from anywhere. And that actually a lot of the people who are excluded from the conversation have the most to add, and treating everyone with that basic dignity and respect of like, you've got a perspective, it's interesting. Some of your ideas are not going to be great, but your ideas are still worth being heard. Just seeing that time and time again, that good ideas would come. Either they'd come from the margins, from places you never would have thought of, or they come from the interactions between different people where the best idea was something that no individual could have had. You had to have like the conflict of different perspectives coming together. And then you're like, well, if we really go at this and turn it around until, if the objective is how do we grow as much shared understanding as possible? And how do we treat difference as a resource, and really listen into what people's concerns are? With enough patience and enough trust and a good process, you can come up with proposals that are really incredible, that really satisfy a lot of different concerns. So that was like kind of mind-blowing too, because before that, all I'd seen was, like a top-down autocratic decision-making method where it's like someone's in charge and they tell you what to do. Or it's the kind of thing you have in Parliament where it's a majority vote and 49% of the people leave unhappy all the time. So that was like this introduction to, there's a thing called governance, there's a thing called group process, there's a thing called culture, and all of these are objects that we can take into our hands and modify, that we've got choices about how we organize and how we talk to each other. And if we take different choices, we get different outcomes, like the way that the way that the US is different from Saudi Arabia it's partly about the way those countries are structured, like the way the organizations function, the way the governance works, and the way the economy works. And so I think it was this, for me, this gateway into, all of the stuff that I took for granted as just being the way things are, is all optional. It's all up for grabs. It's all like, we can do things differently. We can experiment. Some of the experiments are going to be annoying, but some of them are going to have breakthroughs. And it set me on this quest of like optimism and hope,
Awesome. So it seems like you've come at this from, we've had a number of folks on the show before who've talked about other guiding principles here for better organizations. A lot of it seems like it came to you from associations, relationships, experience, and you backed out to maybe finding some design patterns over time and then awakening to certain things that you weren't necessarily aware of at the time, that they were narratives you were swimming in that weren't necessarily you were aware of, right? So you ended on Loomio, and then I kind of came back and said, wait a minute, what did you actually learn? And so maybe this then dovetails us back to Loomio, right? You've had these key findings around direct democracy, possibilities, and all of that. How did you land? Where did that land you with respect to the organization that you founded?
Yeah, I think honestly, there was a feeling at Occupy and a disposition and a vibe, these kind of vague things. And me and my buddies were like, how do we keep this feeling going? I think that's the honest answer rather than any rational sort of theory of change or like, if this, then that. It wasn't quite like that. But we got really lucky that at the same time as Occupy was kicking off, we got introduced to this freelancers collective called Inspiral. And I guess part of the Occupy experience was meeting people constantly, like being in the public space and just meeting all kinds of different people, from like politicians and business owners to people who live on the streets. And these Inspiral characters who I'd vaguely heard of but never seen. And they were and still are participatory, bottom-up kind of entrepreneurial community where people support each other to do more meaningful work and to like bootstrap meaningful startups and things like that. And so we got talking to them and realized that even though they were working in the business world, which as an activist and a punk, I didn't really connect with, they had so many of the same values and principles of organizing as what we were doing. It was like, oh, right. Like if anyone's going to teach me how to organize, it's this crowd. They actually know how to do non-hierarchical organizing. So basically we started hanging out with them and getting excited and dreaming up ideas. And one of the ideas was, okay, the General Assembly, this direct democracy process is cool. It's exciting, but it also sucks. Like it sucks in small ways. Like it's all face-to-face. It's limited to one person speaking at a time and everyone listening. It's limited to who can be there at that time. And if you're not there, you don't get to participate. But it also sucks in bigger ways. Like once you're an experienced consensus participant, you know how to hijack the whole process and wield your veto rights aggressively and so on. So we started cooking up the idea of like, could we do something like the General Assembly, but put it on a computer so that it's more accessible and that we could experiment with different configurations and see what kind of different outcomes we get from running different styles of decision-making. And I mean, I don't feel like we invented that idea. I think at the time there were numerous conversations online with different people talking about this and getting a certain way into the project of like, oh, we're actually going to start a software project. It's just that Loomio, as far as I know, was the only one that went the distance. And I attribute that to Inspiral. That Inspiral was like a community, a place of support, a garden. It was like the fertile soil for the seed of the idea to fall into. And all the other people that had a similar idea just didn't have enough support to get it off the ground. But yeah, so we were like, oh, maybe we can do something around decision making. All of the organizations in the world have trouble with decisions. Maybe we can do something, maybe we can improve it. There's really still, even to this day, really a lack of good decision support software online. So it's obvious to me there's like problems to be solved there. So we said, this is going to be our product. And we don't know what we're doing. None of us have built a software company before, but we'll figure it out. And we kind of just approached everything from first principles, from like, yeah, what should the software be? But also, how should we structure the company, and how should we do financing, and how should we manage ourselves? All that sort of stuff just came at it from first principles, not assuming. Well, we assumed that everything that had been done in the past was completely wrong and had no value. Threw that all out. And then, yeah, just started the process of designing an organization that fit, very idealistic values.
Yeah, I think what you said there, starting out with the assumption that everything else is wrong before you, is one that we often see here with some of the folks you brought on the show, from the Web3 and DAO space for sure. The sort of lack of engagement with at least saying, hey, at least these folks fucked it up. How do we make a new mistake, right? Which is critical. So you touched on a lot of super interesting stuff there, but I think, building decision support software for common management challenges, then it's not the thing it ended up being, right? You started off more, I really like how you put it. You rode the vibe that came out of it, right? Like, how do we continue with the vibes, right? Maybe we build a software product. Now let's get a little bit more into this, because this is a thing we're also super interested in, right? When you want to co-build, co-design, co-own something with your friends like this, right? It can be pretty complicated. We had Jason Wiener on the show really early to talk about VC investment and just investment in general for worker cooperatives, right? The seed problem for worker cooperatives. So how did you folks go about doing this? Did you bootstrap it? Did you raise funding? Did you, what was that early process like?
Yeah, I wouldn't have known this originally, but looking back, the first round of funding came from the government, in the sense that in New Zealand, it's not great, but there is a social safety net so that people who don't have jobs can still pay their rent. And so a bunch of us punks were receiving that benefit from the government. And that kind of took the pressure off and gave us a bit of room to experiment. And then also you've got Inspiral. So Inspiral had co-working space, which was basically there's always a kind of like Robin Hood model in that community, where there's some people who are earning good money and they're kind of basically generous with their resources, so that the other people who don't have money but do have a cool idea or doing something for like a positive impact can benefit from it. So we had a free space to work. We had a community of people around us that had experience in business and in technology. Some of us were getting paid by the government to be unemployed. And then after, that was kind of the first couple of months. And then we did a small crowdfunding campaign. I think it was like $5,000. That was more like a validation. Like, do people care about this? Is this interesting? And that kind of got oversubscribed instantly overnight. It's when we realized, like, oh, we've got a story here that people care about, whether or not the product's going to be useful. People care about the story. And then at some stage, we had to, maybe it was at that point of that first crowdfunding, that we had to make decisions about formal incorporation. And we did a bunch of research and settled on the worker cooperative form, even though at the time there was no worker co-ops in New Zealand. There's tons of like producer co-ops. Like the majority of the New Zealand economy actually, I think, still runs through co-ops. Like the whole farming industry and all of the supermarkets and stuff, they're all co-ops, but they're not worker co-ops. It's like quite a different feel. So we had this kind of weird operation, but it just seemed like the right thing for our values, because the whole mission of Loomio is about involving people in the decisions that affect them. It's like, well, what organizational structure does that imply? It implies one member, one vote to me.
Right.
Or something like it. Maybe something more sophisticated would be fine. But that was the obvious choice for us that matched our values and what we were trying to achieve in the world. And then we did so many things, it's hard to keep track of the sequence, but somewhere along the line, we did a much bigger crowdfunding campaign, which was a few $100,000. I love crowdfunding in the sense that people give you money and you don't owe them anything apart from your best effort. Like you have to live up to the story, but you don't actually, it's not on the books as like a debt.
Yeah.
That's pretty good. And then we did the redeemable preference shares model, which Nathan Schneider did a really good write-up in Yes Magazine. For anyone that wants to like dig into the details about how they went down, maybe we can add that link. It's a really useful explanation of like what is a redeemable preference share and blah, blah, blah. But basically it's like a complicated, slightly complicated, or it's unfamiliar, at least in the New Zealand investment landscape, an unfamiliar vehicle for getting money into a worker co-op, because worker co-ops don't have traditional equity. And so you can't just say, here's our valuation and we'll give you this percentage of the equity for that amount of money. Like, that's not an option for us. And has been, I think, like one of the main themes throughout the entire Loomio journey has been, well, I mean, the short version is I feel like we've been undercapitalized the whole time because we've had such a strident approach to our values that has cut us off from a lot of, we're kind of like not willing to make compromises. And so that's cut us off from a lot of funding.
What does the cap table look like now? Like, how does it work when you go through one of these? Because it's almost like debt financing, right?
Yeah. I'm trying to get my head into the game. It's been a while since I had to look at that kind of stuff. And it's complicated because one of the later things that we did was then we formed like traditional LLC that the co-op owns. And so the LLC has got a normal looking cap table, but the cap table of the co-op is like, each of the members has one share and a share is worth $1, so it's complicated. That's the short answer. In the LLC, there's like a couple of big investors. So I think still the biggest one is, I don't know if I'm allowed to even name who it is, but basically there's a tech entrepreneur from South Korea who made it big in the first dot-com wave, and came out the other side with the sense of like, I made a lot of money and that's nice, but I didn't have social impact that I wanted to with my tech companies. And so he basically went on, he funded Kickstarter and Reddit and these kind of places with this intention of like, the internet has to have a positive social impact. What we've mostly seen, the people that dominate the internet now are not necessarily having a positive impact. And his explanation for why that is because of the legal structures. It's because of the way the ownership works. And so he was really one of the few people who was really willing to fund an unusual structure. He sort of understood the reasoning for it, was like, you do have to do something interesting with investment and ownership if you want to prioritize social impact. Because if you just do things the traditional way, you wind up prioritizing making profit, and it sort of like takes over all of your other values. So yeah, there's a couple of basically wealthy individuals like that. And then a broader pool of our friends and family and other people that were foolish enough to support idealism. But it's been like I say, we've been undercapitalized most of the time, and we've tried to make up for that by earning revenue and turning it into a profitable business so that we're not too worried about the capital side of things.
So it seems like you're really just mission aligned with a group of peers coming out of the Occupy Wall Street movement, and you've really just been trying to figure out the legal framework and financing framework to remain mission aligned around this ideal, as opposed to when we think of a lot of entrepreneurs or a number of entrepreneurs that come out of kind of the traditional VC framework. It's really about, how do I scale this thing as quickly as possible? And even if they start out mission aligned, that financing can, in many cases, though not all, compromise those values. When you hear kind of story after story of this, I know we're kind of talking about firm level or organizational level dynamics, but one of the things that you brought up made me think about your experience in traveling in the US and this culture of scarcity, maybe is the best way to put it. You talked a little bit about how, having a safety net in New Zealand was critical to your ability to create, to essentially take some risk. Can you talk a little bit about just your experience in the US? Because we think of the US as a pretty dynamic place. The largest companies in the world are there. If you look at most measures of entrepreneurship, the US comes out on top. If you look at many measures of nonprofit participation or participation associations, the US comes out on top, although there's been a lot of work showing the decline in that, starting with Robert Putnam, with Bowling Alone, and then kind of the decline in civic institutions over the past 20 years. What was your experience in traveling in the US in 2016 and 2017, and how would you compare it to kind of the experience in New Zealand, where you're no longer as well? You've actually moved to Europe because of the dynamic in New Zealand.
Yeah. I mean, it's a little bit like I wrote about this experience of going to the US in 2017, and it's a little bit like, a privileged country hick goes to the big city and discovers what the real world's like. That's kind of the theme. Where, I was just kind of shocked when I went to the US. I mean, even a couple of weeks ago, one of my friends, I've got a friend, she's a young woman, she lives in Argentina. Argentina being a third world country that's in decline, and it's like super violent, and it's a really dangerous place to be. She went to the US recently and was like scared for her life and was like, this place is terrifying. I've got to get out of here. Like you tell the story about the US being this very dynamic entrepreneurial ecosystem. It's also like, I mean, there's just so many people who don't have the basics they need to live, like seeing how many people are living in tents, living on the street, like just completely wasted in the kind of like zombie mode of opiates. Like that was shocking to me, coming from a place where, I mean, there's some homelessness in New Zealand. It's not like a paradise, but the kind of magnitude and the intensity is just like a completely different ballpark. So yes, you do have like, Y Combinator and Silicon Valley and these kind of things where there is some of the best entrepreneurship in the world is happening there. But you also have the extreme at the other end of just like so many people falling through the cracks and so many lives wasted. And that was one thing that really, really shocked me, like going through some of the homeless encampments in like Oakland and Portland and stuff, and just meeting people there and just being like, wow, you got, it seems like a lot of people's lives are being wasted because of some basically like bad luck. Like you got a medical bill or something like that, and then you couldn't pay the rent, and then blah, 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 like that was really shocking to me. But then I think the other piece was my trip in the US was mostly meeting with kind of like progressive and radical activists. And I was expecting more of a DIY culture than I found. I was expecting, like in New Zealand, people are very practical. They just do stuff. Like everyone I know in my hometown in Wellington is creative. Like they're just doing stuff all the time. And it seemed like that wasn't, well, I didn't see as much action as I was expecting. And the best that I could come up with was that people have to be more, because of this economic context where there is no safety net, you just have to, like you have to earn money, and you have to, if you don't do it, no one else will, kind of thing. You've got to look after yourself and your family. I think it leaves a bit less left over. There's like the margins are tighter. There's not so much surplus. There's not enough there's not enough left over to share or to experiment or to say like, yeah, we're going to do this. Like where I lived in this weird underground punk house, which was constantly putting on concerts and stuff for free, like because it's interesting and fun. I found like I was looking for more of that than I found. And that I assumed a big part of that was because people are just hustling so hard to make sure that they can pay their rent. The stakes just seem a lot higher there.
Yeah. And I think it might even be, so there's this issue of kind of the welfare state or a social safety net or kind of a society that cares for people that can't take care of themselves for short periods of time. But I think there's something a little bit more, there might be more to this, because if you look at what I remember just in school when I was studying economics at Chicago, like we would always make the comparison between places like the US and the EU. And we would say, yeah, the US has more risk and it doesn't have the social safety net, but you also have lower unemployment. The EU has higher unemployment. But that really over the past decade has changed. The US may have lower unemployment, but if you look at the labor participation rate in the US, people are just dropping out of the labor force, and it really hasn't come back. And so in the US, you kind of got up to a labor participation rate of 66%. We're now down to 62%, whereas in the EU, we're now at nearly 74%. And so there's more people working than ever in the EU, despite the fact that you have the ability to not work, or you have more of an ability to not work within the EU than you do in the US. And this kind of got me thinking about some of these design principles, going back to kind of the micro environment that you've come up with for creating organizations where people want to work, where people want to show up, where people feel inspired. And I'm wondering if you could you've actually written a book on this, or a couple books, I think, on this. If you could go into some of kind of the framework in detail around those design patterns that you've uncovered that lead to vibrant organizations where people feel empowered and feel that they can participate, not just in the fact that they're physically showing up, but are actually meaningfully contributing to the dynamic in the room.
I should probably scope it a little bit to say, like, the people that I'm writing for for some reason, they woke up one day with this sense of like, I don't know exactly how they would describe it, but like hierarchy is not the way. Inclusion, democracy, bottom up, grassroots, participation. We need that kind of stuff. There's some people that have those values. I don't know where it comes from, but this kind of conviction, like there must be a better way than the traditional top-down command and control corporate structure. So those are the people that I'm talking to, is the people. I'm not trying to convince people that are in a traditional organization to overthrow the hierarchy and embrace decentralization, but the ones that have already, for some reason, made that commitment or have crossed that threshold, I've been writing for them to say, like, the reason that we have hierarchy, the reason that we structure our organizations in this way with like, carrots and sticks and so on, is because coordinating is hard. And we've figured out that using this hierarchical model is a kind of stable pattern. No one thinks most people don't think it's the best idea ever, but they're like, at least this works. And so if you're going to reject the traditional hierarchy and go a different way, you're going to have to do a lot of R&D. You're going to basically encounter a lot of challenges along the way. Like, how do you do decisions without spending hours and hours and hours on the most mundane stuff? And where does accountability come from if you don't have a boss that can threaten you with punishment? Those are real difficult questions. In my travels, encountering lots of decentralized groups, I found them all like we did with Loomio, like, we'll throw out everything about organizing and say everyone in the past was wrong. We're going to invent everything from scratch. The problem with inventing everything from scratch is like there's a whole bunch of organizing challenges, which any one of them is big enough to completely destroy your enterprise. Like if you don't have accountability, or if you don't know how to make decisions, or if you can't manage conflict, or if you can't manage your cash flow, like there's a bunch of these topics that if you don't get it right, you're going to die. Your organization's going to die. So innovating on all fronts simultaneously is not very likely to succeed. And so what I was trying to do with my book, Patterns for Decentralized Organizing, is to say, look, these are sort of like the top 10 challenges that all decentralized organizations face. And these are some of the things you can do about it. And I can't prescribe to you exactly like you should just do this, you should just structure your organization in this way. But these are the kind of the tools and the practices and the frameworks, like the mental models that have made a difference for other organizations. You can try them out. So on that question about engagement and people like wanting to work, absolutely. When people have a lot of autonomy and agency, and when they are connected to a sense of purpose, when they have a sense of belonging with their teammates, like the problem is, how do you get them to stop working because they burn out? It's not how do I engage my workforce or something, And we see this at the moment completely across the board on Web3, is everyone is just like way overdoing it because they've got so much passion and so much autonomy, and they feel such a sense of responsibility and a sense of friendship and solidarity with other people in the movement. It's just like, we're going. So that's not really the problem anymore. It's like, how do you channel that energy in a way that's constructive and useful and sustainable? And that's where you need, like you might not have a manager, but you still need to do some kind of management. There still needs to be some structures and policies in place. You need to have some system for noticing what's working and what's not working, and being able to change, like to be conscious about what your processes currently are and how you can improve them. And I mean, to get to the principles part, I think where I've landed is basically that, I guess one piece, there's kind of maybe two. One piece is prioritize the vibe, like vibes is king or queen, monarch, meaning the social fabric, the sense of connection, the sense of belonging and purpose. That is the thing that you can't do without. Like you can run out of money. You can completely miss your product market fit. You can have a really difficult conflict or severe disagreements and all that sort of thing. But once you run out of trust and once you run out of respect for each other, like you're dead in the water. There's no coming back from that. And so the priority is, how do we look after our relationships? How do we create a working culture that feels awesome, where people are respected and they know they're going to be taken care of? And if you prioritize that, then I believe that really good work happens as a result. So that's the first principle, prioritize the vibe. And then the second principle is just to iterate a lot, and not just like people are familiar with this in startup land of like, you do like agile product development. And so you make a rough prototype and then you show it to some customers and then you improve it a bit and then you just keep looping and looping. It's basically applying that process to your organizational design and saying like, okay, for the next month, we're going to do decisions in this way. And then at the end of the month, we're going to stop and review and iterate and say, well, what did we learn from that? And what's a little tweak that we could do for the next iteration? And when you have the first principle of like good relationships and like a lot of trust and a sense of safety, where people are going to be transparent with each other, they're actually going to communicate with candor. And then you run these iterative loops on how can we improve our ways of organizing. Pretty quickly, you get into a self-correcting evolutionary pathway, where the group can just kind of adjust its posture to meet whatever the challenges of the day. And it has just incredible resilience and flexibility. So like in our organization at Loomio, there was a point where, funding fell through and we ran out of budget and we're looking around the room going, we can't pay everyone anymore. And because we have this really high quality relationships and a transparent process for dealing with whatever challenges come our way, basically the outcome of that moment was a bunch of us agreed transparently and consensually to not get paid for a while. Another group decided to like drop their wages so they could afford to keep someone else on, so that we all shared the limited resource. It's like when everyone is engaged in the sense of, they have a sense of ownership, and in our case, they actually legally do have ownership, the amount of creativity and flexibility that comes in as a result is really incredible. So yeah, those are the two pieces. And I don't know if that is useful or if that's so abstract that we need to drop down another level.
No, I think there's two things that came out of it for me. I mean, there's actually been good quantitative work that kind of reiterates or highlights what you just, or underscores what you just said around resilience in times of crisis for people that are working in cooperatives. So cooperatives actually go through recessions at a higher success rate. They're more likely to survive in the first 5 years of business than traditional startups. And so there might be a narrow band to their success, but in times of crisis and also in the early days when you're trying to get to product market fit and trying to get customers to actually adopt whatever you're working on, they are more likely to survive. And so I think that quantitative work, and we'll share some papers for people that are interested, actually underscores some of the qualitative stuff that you're saying and the design patterns that you've highlighted and actually written about fairly extensively. I guess one of the questions that comes up for me is, it's funny, I had the opportunity to meditate with this guy who is phenomenal, Kinshino. He's this Swiss German guy. And I hesitate to even bring it up because I'm, just not meditating these days, and wish I was doing more of it. But one of the things that always sticks in my mind about what he says is, humans don't scale very well, and our institutions don't scale very well. And I'm just wondering, when I hear you, I kind of go back to, sitting in the Sangha and hearing a Kinshino speak in a couple of ways. And I'm just wondering, does the work that you're doing scale?
Yes, it's just a different scaling model than we're familiar with. So one of the frameworks that has really helped my way of thinking is this idea of the partnership and domination spectrum from Rian Eisler. And it's this idea that it's an oversimplification, right? But it kind of says any human relationship, either between peers or between countries, at any scale, it can you can relate to someone as a partner or in a sort of domination submission relationship. So it's kind of either horizontal or vertical, and it's a spectrum. So you can be more or less, you can be a little bit domineering or a complete fascist, right? So there's a spectrum of options there. I think the vast majority of organizations that we see visibly through, especially the last sort of 5,000 or 6,000 years of human history, have scaled the domination model. And that's about really clear chain of command, really clear hierarchy. But a lot of that has come, partly that's a cultural thing and partly a psychological thing and a trauma thing. But it's also just information theory, when information was expensive to move around, it kind of made sense to organize everything into these departments and to have a really clear, information goes up, decisions come down. That kind of made sense. But we're living through a transition now where networks are actually much more efficient than institutions. Information doesn't cost anything to move around. Everyone can have access to everything. And so just that basic information theory side of things changes the game entirely. And you can talk to activists and radicals like me and my friends, but you can also talk to the US Army, right? I really recommend this book, Team of Teams by General Stanley McChrystal. And he explains how big chunks of the US Army now operate on a completely decentralized model with the smallest amount of hierarchy they can get away with. And it's all about pushing information and autonomy out to the edges. And the job of the people at the top of the hierarchy is kind of like spotting where the gaps are and asking good questions and making sure that things are not falling through, but they're not really calling the shots. It's like people on the edges are calling the shots because they have the best access to information. So like, I think just on that pure, almost like computational layer, this kind of concrete, how does the information flow? How do we make good decisions? I think because of the way information technology is changing, we're going through a transformation in what's possible for different modes of organizing. So that's one dimension. But I guess the side that I've become more interested in is this like cultural, psychological level, So I'm definitely coming with a bias that I think this domination submission pattern is inferior to the partnership pattern. Like I'd rather be surrounded by peers who respect me. Partnership for me means we're different. We're not equal. We're not pretending to all be the same. We've all got different competencies, different strengths, different values, different perspectives. And partnership means that those different characters come together in a spirit of like mutual curiosity, mutual respect, spirit of exchange, and like, what can we learn from each other? Whereas the domination submission model is like, you just rank who is the most important or who's the strongest or who's the richest, and you give the power to the people at the top of the ranking. Yeah, I just prefer, and I think a lot of people would prefer to be surrounded with partnership relationships rather than domination submission ones. And I think it's like the kind of common stories we tell about human history are all focused on this domination side of the spectrum. But I think there's pretty compelling evidence that it's not the only way that things have been done. Like the book that's currently getting a lot of attention is The Dawn of Everything by David Wenger and David Graeber, where they're saying their argument is basically like pre-agriculture at least, and even post-agriculture a little bit, but definitely pre-agriculture, the norm was experimenting with different social forms, and some of them at very large scale, like whole cities that were organized without any obvious center point of command. So it can scale, but for one thing, it's scaling usually based on replication rather than like I was saying about Occupy, like we had simultaneous actions in 3,000 cities because everyone was just replicating a bunch of ideas that they saw on the internet, and it was a permissionless environment for them to do that. So that's operating at scale with a huge amount of both power and dexterity, nimbleness, responsiveness, that would be enviable for any organization, any top-down organization. But there was no one in the top of the hierarchy of the Occupy org chart that could call the shots and say, no, you can't do that, or yes, you must do that. There's no one with that coercive authority. And for me, that's a feature, not a bug. But I guess the other piece of it is like, I mentioned the word trauma. Like the way that I see it, domination is the norm. Like I described my family, and I come from a loving family. It's great. I love my parents. They love me. It's not like I'm showing up with this like terrible story or something, but still I was trained to obey. And sometimes that kind of parenting was completely focused on my growth and development and safety. And like they were putting boundaries in place because that's what kids need, to be safe and to grow healthy, is they need some boundaries. But also sometimes it was just easier for my dad to say, well, I'm the boss. We do it my way. You don't get a say. And not just my dad, right? Like my teachers, the people in church, like my interactions with the state was like everywhere that I looked was there's someone else out there who calls the shots, who tells me what I have to do. And if they are in a position of power, I can't disagree with them or else I'm going to be punished. And I think that leaves a significant amount of trauma on people. I think a lot of people are traumatized by having to go to school and having to ask to use the bathroom. Like what an absurd concept that I have to put my hand up and say, Miss, I need to pee. Can I please? And that's the norm. I'm not talking about drastic events that, it's not like a war zone where you expect people to get PTSD. It's like just normal everyday life, I think, is still traumatizing people. And so when people try and step out of that dominator mode where they say, okay, we're not going to do that. We're going to be more like democratic, more inclusive, more partnership oriented. We've still got all of our conditioning, all of our patterns that we learn. Like I was basically trained to submit some of the time and then look for the opportunities where it's my turn to dominate. And that's like something that I learned since I was a baby. It's not something that I can just switch off because I say, oh, I'm in a co-op now, I'm going to stop doing that. It takes a lot more than that. So I think a lot of the attempts that we've seen for people to scale a different way of organizing, like Occupy, for example, operating in really it's not like a nutritious context. It's an oppositional context. It's like we're trying to do something wholesome and positive and democratic in an environment that just doesn't support that, where all of the biases are pushing the other way. And not just the biases outside of us. It's not just like the weather out there is bad. It's also what's happening inside of us, our own reflexes and instincts and mindsets and ways of thinking. You know, like there's a lot of people that you give them a bunch of autonomy and they don't know what to do with it because they've never had it before. No one's ever asked them, what do you want to do? It's like, no, what am I supposed to do? What do I have to do? What's expected of me? So yeah, there's this whole kind of internal psychological, interior stuff that needs to change. And that changes in a culture. So like if we had a culture of like a partnership oriented culture, then I think you'd see lots and lots of partnership oriented organizations thriving and scaling at a great pace. But most of us don't grow up in that context. Most of us live in a domination context. So yeah, it's a bit like trying to establish human civilization on Mars, like it's probably possible, but you're really pushing against the grain.
You bring up so much there. It's hard to kind of encapsulate the next question, but I mean, you brought up kind of the dawn of everything. And one thing that I was really surprised in reading that was just the concept that inequality really, to even question inequality wasn't really something that Europeans did until they interacted, or one of the main theses was it wasn't really something that they did until they interacted with indigenous tribes in America that had practiced the ability to be in dissent with one another in a respectful way and had cultivated that as a muscle over time. And it seems like a lot of the work that people are doing within DAOs, and it's not just within DAOs, right? Because you see this in military strategy, you see this in kind of what's happening where you have troops that are in small teams that are able to make real-time decisions on the ground, often beating larger armies, both within traditional state structures and within kind of non-traditional state structures. But I guess one of the things that's most interesting about this kind of episode today is that we've got someone who's operated outside of the context of a DAO, trying to figure this out. And we've also got Jad on here who's operating within DAOs today. And I'm wondering, Jad, are you seeing kind of within the DAO itself, the ability to scale now and put some of these design patterns into place through sub-DAOs? What's the most interesting stuff that's coming out of or utilizing some of the principles and patterns that Richard really has been helpful in developing? And how is that being institutionalized now within DAOs that are scaling and managing $1 billion plus treasuries?
Yeah, definitely. So I think the first thing is to say that most DAOs are not. Right. Most DAOs are taking the approach that Richard mentioned earlier in this call, which is that pretend nothing useful happened in the past and we'll do everything from scratch. Right. That's just my observation. Right. I could be completely wrong on this. I'm not looking in the right corners of the internet, but that is just my observation of what I've seen, because I will suggest things like liberating structures, or I'll, suggest something else that's it's kind of stayed, tested, time-honored pattern or handbook for these things where you can begin to experiment with it and people will be like, oh, I never heard of that. Well, I haven't even looked into that. Oh, that sounds interesting, right? So I've interacted with probably like 20 DAOs at this point, both from facilitating deals with them or token swaps or chatting, looking at what they were going to do when they go to market, et cetera. So I think that's like number one. However, that being said, I do think there are some that are doing really, really interesting work. Gnosis Guild in particular comes to mind. So if I could think of what Richard is talking about in writing a book on patterns of decentralized organizing, and then I think to myself, who closest to vibing with Richard on this in real life DAOs right now, it'd have to be Kia Krittler and the folks at Gnosis Guild, who are basically they do take the approach of learning from the past and really studying previous patterns of organization and saying, what can we learn from them? How can we adapt them? And then adapt them to the networked societies that we're building, network digital societies that we're building, right? And so Gnosis Guild in particular is cool because it provides a number of design patterns out of the box that go beyond just, hey, here's a token, here's a one token, one voting structure. There's a number of design patterns within that where you can set stuff like we're only going to have we're going to set a cap on a particular proposal where this much token no longer gives you this much, representative voting in a particular structure. There's a number of things like this that basically say, how can we even out the weird governance where people just said, owning a bunch of one token, one vote, but I can buy more tokens can lead to adverse outcomes. And then there's a number of other organizational patterns that plug into things Gnosis has built that kind of help you scale decision making. So if anyone who's in the Web3 crowd is listening to this, one of the most dreaded things you can hear or get DM'd is, hey, do you want to be on this multi-sig? So both only because that implies a level of engagement that never happens. So just to clear up the jargon, right? Multi-signature wallet is one where you can basically invite anywhere from like 3 to, I don't remember the exact number. It could be 15, 12, 11, something like that. People to use their digital private keys for their wallet to co-own and co-sign transactions for basically shares of something or tokens of something, a financial value within a digital wallet, right? And I say that this is the most dreaded thing ever because while we like to talk about things like, coordination is the only thing and always has been, and this, that, and the other, you will quickly find that there are people who just disappear, right? And so you need them to make a decision and they're impossible to reach. And so I think that, and so folks in Gnosis, the Gnosis Guild, they're developing patterns for engagement, things like this that kind of I've seen that are really interesting. On the other side of this, we talked about spinning out sub-DAOs, right? So there is, to go back to one of Richard's other points around networked forms of organization, this is one of the key advantages that I think we need to experiment within DAOs is that we scale up to, let's just use the completely made up Dunbar's number, right? It's like, I don't want to open another conversation about Dunbar's number and how made up it is, but let's just use that one, right? Once you get to about that ballpark of people, and I'm sure Richard, maybe you've seen something to the same effect, right? Which is why you picked that nice range of 300 to 300 people for Loomio, when I noticed in some of the marketing, right? Once you get to that 150 people or so, it becomes pretty difficult to corral people, shape decisions, structure the things that you even want to make decisions about. And so what I've seen out there is that folks are now trying to build funding mechanisms and governance mechanisms that make it easy to spin out a group of people who are very productive and who want to go work on a thing that critically ladders back value to the original DAO, right? So a couple things just to throw them out there is a company called Radical that is building a decentralized GitHub, but is also just prolific in building a lot of other things as well. And one of the things they built is Radical Drips. And Drips is basically, you can think of it as a income streaming to any wallet that you direct it at. So let's say you have a treasury and you can set a number of wallets, and it could basically stream a constant or milestone set number of income to those wallets. And one of the use cases that's being used here is then to pay contributors to DAOs, right? So let's say when we think about the narrative space of company building, which all of us here have had to deal with this, right? As founders of something, one thing or another, when we're speaking to employees, fellow employees, contributors, whatever, we have, why are we here? What is our vision? What is our mission? All that. And we meet on a daily basis or a weekly basis. And we say, are we still doing the things? What things should we be doing? What things should we stop doing? Eventually, when you get to that Dunbar's number of people, some people go, actually, there's this opportunity over there that I think if we go after, if we just stop focusing on the main thing, right? And as a product person personally, I've always kind of used that as the guiding thing to prioritize what we build and what we work on. And if someone says, hey, here's a thing that's kind of maybe not antithetical, but not quite on point with what we're doing, that's not a thing we build in a Web 2 context or, hierarchical company context. But here, when you have this design space of tools, you can actually say, great, that actually does line up pretty well with what we're doing. What if we take a 3% of our token allocation, spin out a sub DAO, and then also set up a milestone of Radical Drips that basically says, hey, once you deliver the first bit of this code or for the product, we'll unlock the first milestone. And until then, we'll stream at this constant rate so you're fed, right? And you can pay your bills and all that, right? But you need to reach this next milestone to unlock the next drip, right? So there's all these little mechanisms like this. And since you can actually make legible some of these activities, like a product being brought to market, a particular part of code actually merged, a new feature that's enabled that would point back some income stream to the DAO, you can then automate some of that and say, great, I don't need to actually be there to say, is the product on point? Does it work? Does every single thing actually do the thing it's supposed to do? I can set up a number of milestones that let my DAO folks who want to break out. I can get some financial upside, and I can manage the relationships much easier with some of the technology that's being built here, right? So I think that's some of the most exciting stuff that I've seen out there. One part of it I'm also working on in Prime DAO, right? So I'm not going to pump my bags here. We'll talk about that later. If you have questions, people can DM me. I'm happy to talk about that stuff, but not here.
Yeah, I guess one of the things that's been coming up in one of the conversations that I'm having for an institution that's currently worth a significant amount and has VC investors in is once you set up these sub DAOs, once you set up kind of these teams with a lot of autonomy, and like you said, maybe have their own budget allocated to them, and they can work with that budget to work on a project that may be tangential to the current kind of main mission and focus of the DAO is what do you do if that project starts competing, right? And how do you set up the rules for that? And so I think we've been living in this, as we talked about on last week's pod with the head of macro at the UN, this expansionary environment where there's a lot of room to create, and we aren't yet in this kind of scarcity mindset. But I'm interested to see as we go into a downturn now, if some of this what happens to the dynamic around organizing. And you see this with some of the mergers that are happening and with DAOs now, or the mergers that are happening with tokens. You see a lot of animosity between those in terms of the value that was shared between the different chains, et cetera. So pretty exciting time.
What this brings up for me is I think there are kind of competing mindsets maybe when it comes to organizing in Web3. And there's one mindset which is like, I mean, based on the trajectory of DeFi, which to me is all about DeFi makes all assets liquid. And it doesn't matter what your random token is, there's always going to be a market for it, and you can flip it for something else. I think there's a mindset about the future of work, which is about making workers liquid and like completely fungible, and a kind of standardization of working procedures so that you don't have to know anything about each other. You just kind of plug in, and there's like this amazing AI organization. That's kind of, I think that's sort of what I got from the original definition of what a DAO is that it's kind of like this robot mother, that takes care of all these little babies. And the humans don't have to know anything about each other. They don't have to have relationships. And if they have quirks, those are annoying, and we try and get rid of them, and we try and standardize people and make them as fungible as possible. That's one mindset. It's not really my jam. The other mindset is about like treating humans as a feature, not a bug, treating relationships as a feature, treating difference as a resource, not a problem to iron out. And the reason all this comes up for me is because on the question of both multi-sigs and sub-DAOs, it's all about delegation. And for me, when you have, say, a co-op or a DAO where you've got co-ownership and there's some like very clearly defined boundary, and you say the 10 of us own this thing or the 50 of us own this thing, if you put the effort in to get to know each other in a significant way and understand each other's strengths and like what are our weirdnesses and like what makes us flip out, or like what concerns do we have, what are our values, all that sort of stuff. Once you understand that about each other, there's nothing more efficient than the human ability to track relationships and to deal with the complexity of humans, for being able to delegate and just say, actually, Rich, you're by far the best qualified person for this thing. And Jared, you can do that thing over there. And you don't need to go through some formalized process of getting the role allocated to you. And you don't have to sign off on everything and go through this. Like it seems like DAOs have this risk of becoming incredibly bureaucratic as a consequence of like not investing in good relationships. And I'm like, no, invest in great relationships, prioritize the vibe, get to know each other. And then you can just deal with stuff as it comes up. Like, it turns out your sub-DAO is now kind of in competition with us. I mean, that happens in the Inspiral community all the time, that we start companies that are in competition. And the way you deal with it is you talk to your friends who you're in competition with, and you say, hey, you're doing this, we're doing this. Like, how are we going to share the space? And you agree based on terms of friendship and mutual respect. Like, okay, well, why don't you prioritize this little part of the market, and I'll prioritize this, so we don't compete too harshly with each other, and Like you don't need a complicated algorithm if you've got friendship, if you've got respect. And I just don't know, like in the Web3 space, where the balance of power is. It feels like there's some really highly influential characters who are very much on this libertarian, anonymous human, like I would prefer actually if the humans were replaced by robots kind of bent. And then there's this other one, which is much more hippie, free love, like my side. And I just kind of don't know where people are at on that. Maybe you guys have got a better read.
I think.
Yeah, go ahead. You're in Amsterdam right now. So what's the vibe?
I'd say the vibe is spot on for DAOs, Richard, because I think that like, though there isn't a non-side to some of the DAOs who are doing not shady things, they're just, if they happen to not want to go through every last cross T and dotted I for some legal thing, they'll go anon, right? But for the most part, it is this space of vibes. Every workshop is about how we vibe together. How do we make metrics around the vibes? How do we actually, manage these relationships? And I do think that, this backs into one of the things that you were talking about before, right? Which is like in Web3, we have this power, this ability to make new institutional structures, right, with new incentives. And I think that literally backs into the two things you're seeing here, right? Which is like on the DeFi side, and even going back before that Bitcoin side, you see a lot of people who are just, I'm a sovereign individual and I don't care as long as my holdings go up, right? But then on the other side of it, if you take a longer infinite game approach, some of those folks maybe are coming out of reading, books like that and that culture. You definitely see this bifurcation around both of them. And honestly, I think that some go from one community to another all the time, right? There are multiple selves. So, but I think I would also turn this back around on you and say, given this, given that I think these aren't new people being created, these are not new mindsets being created either. They're just being foisted into, they're coming from the dominator partnership model. They're coming from whether they know it or not, right? And do you see anything on your side, even not just in Web3, but even from your, from where you've come, where you've started from, and now ending at Web3? What do you see that suggests that things might be a bit different this time, right? Are they going to end up all that different? Are we all going to be subsumed by token go up and DeFi liquidity and all this?
I think both. I listened to a podcast recently that I really loved. There's this new kind of collective, they're called the Duma Optimists. And this Duma Optimism podcast, and they interviewed Gregory Landauer from Regen Network. And I was really impressed with his way of thinking, because he's like a, permaculture farmer, green thumbs kind of dude who has reluctantly embraced the computer and is like, I think we can change the world if we made a good ecological accounting system. And his way of thinking about the world is like, it's like a radical compromise. It's like, where is the world going? It is going towards hyper-financialization. It is going towards hyper-commodification. It's like everything quantified, everything legible, total surveillance, everything with a number on it and a value on it. Like that's just the way it's going. And it doesn't matter if you like it, it doesn't matter if aesthetically it feels gross. Maybe there's someone out there who's got a plan for interrupting that, but he's just like, I take that for granted that that's where we're going. And how do we intervene in a way? How do we jump into that system and do something that's so excellent that plays the game on its own terms and also brings in a bunch of other values so that we own a corner of that market and it reflects ecological values? I think that's just like such a great way of thinking about it, that there is a current, that Western society at least is going in a certain direction, probably not just Western society. And how do we intervene in a strategic way without wishing, like getting distracted by wishing the world was different or wishing that we were playing a different game of chess than we're currently playing. So that was inspiring for me. So I do think we are going for this like increasingly atomized, increasingly financialized, increasingly precarious world of work. And there are other currents happening at the same time, which pull much more towards the hippie end of the spectrum. So like when we were starting Loomio, it was kind of right as the wave of agile methodology was just starting to crest, where all of the organizations in the know knew that they needed an agile coach and they needed an agile transformation. And a couple of years after we started, it really reached the saturation point where the market was just like overrun with shysters and people that were saying they knew about agile, but they didn't understand the first thing. They just read a few books. And now we're in this kind of, I guess, the trough of disillusionment where a lot of people hear about agile, but they just associate it with the worst kind of management speak, and it doesn't work and it sucks, and Now, I think there is something really profound in the Agile manifesto, and it's hard to scale, and it's really nuanced, and it comes from experience. But yeah, the market went through its hype and disillusionment cycle, as it always does. Now, I think there's like another wave that's coming after that one, and I might be just like wishing this into existence, but it's what I see anyway, is that now people are talking about well-being and about mindfulness and about psychological safety. And it's really, there's this trend of paying attention to people's interior experience, which is quite new. I mean, the pandemic has been a big part of it as well. It's like suddenly everyone's working habits have been interrupted, and it's like, oh, most of our staff have children and they have to deal with that. Like, we've just ignored that. And we've had these traditional gender roles that have made it easier to ignore that. You just say, well, all the men will go to work and all the mothers will stay home, and then we don't have to think about it. But obviously that has been disintegrating for a long time as well. So there's like these different currents in society that are forcing us to consider the whole human being, not just their professional personality and this smaller persona, but who is this human, and what are they experiencing like on the inside as they go to work? And you have things like, Google's Project Aristotle, which is this massive study of what makes an effective team. And the number one thing they can point to is what they call psychological safety, which is building on Amy Edmondson's work from Harvard, which is like psychological safety is a shared belief that this is a place where it's safe to take risks, like interpersonal risks, where I can be vulnerable, I can be real, I can be honest about what's going on, I can disagree with you, I can bring my ideas. There's like space to be different without losing my place in the team. Those kind of qualities are all very sensitive vibes-y qualities. And it's Google of all people saying like, that's the thing that makes the difference. That's how you build a high-performing team. So I think that could be the thing that comes after Agile. Is the way that I frame it is like, everyone kind of learned the lesson from Agile, which is that iterative development is the way to get good stuff cheap. But most organizations are iterating on bullshit, because they have a culture of withholding and a culture of fear. Like, people are not actually exchanging honest information with each other when they're going through those iterative loops. They're like butt kissing and butt covering and hiding as much as they can get away with. And so you're iterating on bullshit. It doesn't actually work. And so you need to be doing this iteration on top of a culture of honesty and safety and candor and mutual respect and so on. So I'm optimistic that there is, like the next big wave in organizational thinking is all about how do we cultivate decent relationships where people come together as adults, as peer-to-peer adults, that they come in the spirit of partnership. And that, I think that will happen regardless of what Web3 does, but it could be a tremendous resource for Web3, because Web3 kind of shows up with, here's an organizing structure, like an ownership structure, an incentive structure, a financializing structure, and all of that sort of stuff to go with the good vibes of like having a team where you feel nice. Say, it's one thing to have a nice team where you feel nice. It's another to do that where you own the company together, like that's the ultimate prize. And that's what we had at Loomio. That's what got me so motivated on this whole journey, was because in Loomio, we're having a great time. We're doing a project that feels meaningful. We're getting paid to work on stuff that we care about, and we own the thing together. It's not like there's one person out there that's like quietly making a profit off our sweat. It's like we're in it together. It's just like such a better way to live and to work. And yeah, it needs both the culture side and the structure side. So I sort of feel like the culture thing is underway, and there's an opportunity for Web3 to deliver on the structure.
Very cool, man. I think I would agree with you too, for the most part, because you mentioned Gregory Landua. I work with the guy almost every day, but basically this power structure and the current incentive structures built around it, right? Like I'll say this, on record too, like, most of the time, it's not that anyone in these places is particularly evil. They're just responding to the thing in front of them, right? Mm-hmm. And so if we have the chance to build the network computer together in a way that doesn't only respond to the short-term market pressure, but in some cases should too, right? So like, and once you have financialization out of the bag, there is literally almost nothing you can do that isn't completely dystopian to put it back in the bag. So at least having the design space in Web3 to make things that are a little bit more positive and experiment those things could potentially get us to those better futures. So I think that's a good spot to end it, man. So this is our, thanks for joining us. And I'll give you one last little spot to shill, because that's normal for the podcast that brings on a lot of Web3 people. Please shill, tell us where to find you online, what you're working on, and all that.
Yeah, great. I love to shill. Thank you. It's good to have permission. I mean, maybe I can start with an offer, which is I feel like I'm in a relatively small cohort of people that have actually got a lot of lived experience in decentralized organizations, and it's not just hype. It's not just the excitement. It's like actually been doing this for more than 10 years now. And I feel like I'm sitting on a bunch of knowledge that I love to share. So I have like quite specific needs around communication. I get overwhelmed pretty easy. So I really do want to talk to lots of people that care about this stuff. But the easiest way to do that is to get me on Twitter in public. Like, ask me a good question about your DAO, tag me in public on Twitter. Don't send me a DM. Don't send me an email, because I won't get to it. But when it's in public, then I get to answer, and it's fun, and I get to bring other people in. And yeah, so that's the thing. I love to talk about this stuff. So join me on Twitter. You'll be, go.
Your Twitter handle as well. Don't forget that.
Rich Decibels. You will be subjected to an onslaught of my stream of consciousness if you do follow me on Twitter, and you'll have to forgive me for that. But I do like talking about this stuff. So that's the offer. And then the request is, if you do want to learn more about the practical stuff, like I mentioned, accountability and conflict and decision-making and shared leadership and all this sort of stuff. My partner, Nati, and I are running a course in June and July, which is going to be I think it's going to be an awesome deep dive into all of this stuff. So if you want to know about that, go to our website, thehum.org, and find out about our Patterns for Decentralized Organizing course. And if you've got weird magic beans, crypto tokens, you can pay me in that too. That's fine.
Excellent. Well, thanks a lot, Rich. As always, it's fun to talk to you. You cover so much in so little time, and I always learn something new chatting with you, man. So thanks for coming on.
It's a great pleasure. I love what you folks are doing with this podcast.